The day after Donald Trump was elected, I built a blanket fort in our living room, and we stayed in it for 3 days. I wish that I could have found out in the 4 years afterwards that this was an overreaction. Clearly, we've seen that it wasn't. I told you this story on the second sermon that I preached as your newly called minister, and I've heard several of you refer back to it metaphorically as we've thought of our respective blanket forts. And I think that many of us can relate to the blanket fort story. But what is really important, I think, is what we all did when we came out of our blanket forts. I saw a lot of lamenting on social media. We did a lot of reading of all the articles, watched the news, shook our heads, wondered how this could happen. But what did we do? Personally, I'm most inspired by the people who decided that they needed to educate themselves more about race, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and white supremacy culture. In this unique time in our history, I think it's important that we turn back to Dr. King's words about his disappointment about white moderates. I think we all need to look at ourselves and ask if we're doing all that we can to dismantle an oppressive system. Now, I'm going to give two caveats that I often talk about when I discuss race. First, I'm going to be using the term white supremacy and white supremacy culture. Those are still loaded words for many. Yes, it includes the fringe and the people who believe that white people are supreme. We saw plenty of them. We saw it 10 days ago, and we have to be reminded over and over again that it is still alive. It should always be condemned by all leaders in the strongest language possible. But white supremacy is not just a term for the fringes. It is a thinking that has embedded our culture and thinking that white is the norm, that white history is the basis of our history and white ways of doing things are considered foundational. It's the naming of the water that we're swimming in. My second caveat is that I think statements by leaders are important. I think that when it's safe, marches and rallies are important. I even think statements on social media are important. But I think the most important thing that we can do is to do our own work. For those of us who are white, that means putting things intentionally in our lives so that we don't fall back into a sense of complacency. Last week, I talked to you about the challenge to not be periodically outraged. I encourage you to all do the reading, the podcasts, follow Black writers, engage in discussions so that you can have a low level of outrage and awareness all the time while caring for your own soul and mental health, of course. As Unitarian Universalists, as you've heard, we do have some unique opportunities to do this right now. As a denomination, we are taking this call to be racist and anti-oppressive very seriously. As you heard, the next class of Beloved Conversations is coming. If you took the fall class, the spring class will have new content. If you didn't, don't worry, you'll step right in. It is not there to educate about history. It's there to have you think differently about race, how you experience the world, and how race shapes you. We also, starting today, that 30 days of siding with love, 30 days of love, it's a self-guided study to help ground you in how to side with love in terms of intersectional racial justice. It's multicultural, and multi-audience generational. There's things for kids and adults. And it came right out of the Commission of Institutional Change as its focus for 2021. Each week, there will be a different playlist or menu of activities that you can do. There's going to be things to read, things to watch, how you can participate, listen, and even worship. And you can still read the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change, this book called Widening the Circle. It's a fascinating look at the systems of racism and how they've become a part of our denomination. As well as intentioned as we Unitarian Universalists are, we do not actually have a good history when it comes to dealing with race. And you can see white dominated thinking in a lot of our systems. I actually have 10 copies of these still in my office. If anyone wants one, just email me. And the link for the bookstore is in there as well. One of the things that I want us to consider in the next coming year or whenever is what theology grounds our work in dismantling racism, individually and collectively. Now, I always like watching your eyes go up when I say the words theology. For many people, your God hackles are raised when I say that. But theology is not just the traditional sense of God. It is about having a common worldview. It's coming to worship on Sunday and knowing that we see the world in similar ways. It's like listening to me or others preach and saying, yeah, what she said. And it's having those values influence us to be better people each and every week. I've heard too many people say you can believe whatever you want as a Unitarian Universalist, and I don't think that's true. Yes, you can resonate with different world religions, or you can say that you don't believe in God and feel very comfortable here, or you can be agnostic, which means you totally don't know if there's a higher power and you're just fine with that. Or you can be a follower of Jesus and really believe the social justice gospel that he was saying. But I would like to submit that we do have a common theology, and that is of a liberation theology. Especially in this congregation, we come here with a mindset that none of us is free until all of us are free. And if we deify anyone, it is those who have stood on the side of the oppressed to seek their liberation. This collective liberation can be seen through the acts of Jesus, of Gandhi, and of Dr. King. But it can also be seen in the actions of Stacey Abrams or in our partners here in Phoenix at Trans Queer Pueblo, who are working to show folks how the Pride Parade has become commercialized and not hospitable to our Black and brown queer siblings. It can be in our partners at Puente and Poder, who have never stopped working for the rights of our immigrant siblings in our detention centers through all of this. But it is more than that. Reverend Sharon Welch notes that from an ethical perspective, we are called to liberate ourselves from bias, and that a theology of liberation frees us from not seeing bias or privileged systems. It's not just freeing others, it is freeing ourselves. Now, I could preach on liberation theology for hours, and beware, I may just do that in the future. So let's look at our common theology another way. Right now, our Unitarian Universalist common worldview comes primarily through our 7 principles. While we don't have a specific creed or statement of belief that we all agree upon, we have these 7 principles that we agree unify us. And that's a thin line because I believe that our principles are mightily close to a creed or a statement of belief. But they are not a statement about God or what elements we must believe in to be in this faith tradition. They are statements that say what we agree with and that guide our actions. They're a little similar. Now, if you think impeachment is an involved process, you should see the process it takes to change or add a principle within the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. It takes many years of studying, so much discussion about language, it would make your head spin, and then several votes over several years. Many in the UU world, including the Black Lives of UU, are asking us to add this 8th principle. They are asking the denomination to do that, but congregations can do it before the denomination does. And the process to adopt it at the congregational level is much easier. So let me remind you what this says, that we affirm and covenant to journey towards spiritual wholeness, that's ourselves, by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism. I love that, accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So how did this eighth principle come about? Much of this information comes from the Eighth Principle Project website, which we're putting in the chat. You can explore more. We had a regional director of racial and social justice, Paula Cole-Jones. She noticed that after working with congregations over 15 years, that there were really two different paradigms in UU circles. One of the UU 7 principles, and one of beloved community or deep multiculturalism. She realized that a person can believe that they are being a good UU and following the 7 principles without ever thinking about or dealing with racism or other oppressions at the systemic level. She was the one who said we needed an 8th principle to rectify this. And our history bears this out. UUs and the UUA have done a very good job in fighting racism, such as the civil rights movement and in the 1990s. But the funding and the support started to wane in the 2000s. Our accountability mechanism failed us. UUs also have a mixed hit record historically in other areas of racial justice. We actually had people on both sides of abolitionism, including people like Jefferson, who was a slaveholder. And some Unitarians were proponents of eugenics, leading to some of the racial extremes of Nazism and apartheid in South Africa. Like all of our history, it's important that we recognize this. For people identified as white, it is too easy to ignore this, which is exactly what keeps the system of racism in our society alive, and in fact, worsening right now. We need to decenter whiteness and other dominant cultures in UUism. The 8th principle comes from an acknowledgement that we need something to renew our commitment to this work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to fulfill the potential of our existing principles. So then what now? Well, we need to decide as a congregation if this is something we want to do. This is not something that I can do. This is the magic of the democratic process. It's something that we must decide collectively if we want this to be a part of our congregation and how we live our vision to be theologically diverse, radically inclusive, and justice-centered. It's something that our board can discuss. It is something that we can vote on in a congregational meeting. It is something that you can give your opinion on to the board. It is something that you can discuss in your team meetings and small groups. So here is my challenge to you. Before Martin Luther King Day tomorrow, and while we see whatever is going to happen this week that show us that we are at the point where white supremacists both have power and are showing the last vestiges of this power. So engage with your own work. 30 Days of Love, Beloved Conversations, Commission on Institutional Change, or your own reading. Don't just deify Martin Luther King and other leaders. Don't let their words make you feel that was history. We need this work now. We need you now. We need you to do your part. And let your congregational leaders know how you feel about adopting this 8th principle. This is the time to come out of our blanket forts and do the internal work, internal to ourselves and internal to our congregation and to our denomination, the internal work of dismantling racism. May it be so in our hearts. May it be so in our congregation, in our government, and in our world.